Okay, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Amy Blair of Dueling Rabbits, who's going to talk about Drawlooms. She is a trained educator, engineer, and passionate handweaver who has dedicated her creative life to Drawlooms and contemporary figurative Damask. Although she is endlessly inspired by the weavings of old, her focus is on the reimagining of traditional designs to reflect the world she sees around her. A resident of Pennsylvania's sunny Lehigh Valley, she is as likely to include steel mills and automobiles in her pieces as the folk motifs of weavers past. Amy's original damask designs have been featured in Complex Weaver's Journal and Joanne Hall's books Drawloom Weaving and Weaving with Long Eye Heddles. Contributions to a couple of more books are in the works, including original material for a reprint of the classic Swedish text Damask and Amy, how do you pronounce it?
Opempta.
Thank you. Coming soon from Babstuga Press. An ardent Drawloom booster, Amy leads the introductory class Drawloom ABC at Babstuga Weaving School and co-teaches with Becky Ashenden and Justin Squazzaro the more advanced Drawloom DEF class as well. Amy's YouTube channel, Dueling Rabbits Handweaving, is entirely and uniquely dedicated to the demystification of drawlooms and the textiles they make possible. Welcome, Amy. Begin when you're
Thank
ready.
you. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here today to talk about my favorite subject in the world, which, as you've guessed, is drawlooms. I am going to try to share my screen right now. Tell me if that looks like anything. Can you guys see what I'm
It's
doing?
working. It's working.
Hooray! Okay. Well, I just want to start a little bit by talking about why I'm a drawloom weaver. And the answer is because with a drawloom, I can weave anything that my imagination can come up with. And I have the added satisfaction of feeling connected to hundreds and hundreds of years of ingenious technology because drawlooms are completely analog. Having said that, I do love technology. And I think that my career and my drawloom weaving have progressed very much hand in hand. Most of my career has been spent in a fracture mechanics laboratory. You can see all of our servo hydraulic test machines there. Doing metallurgical testing for the aerospace, energy, and transport industries. I have spent years surrounded, there's me down in the corner, by complicated machines, carrying out tasks requiring patience, attention to detail, lateral thinking, and a deep understanding of how things work. And I think it's not such a stretch, therefore, to understand why I've chosen drawlooms as my passion and as the center of my creative life. Because drawlooms fascinate me in the same way that Formula One cars or pipe organs do. I think that they are the beautiful blend of art and science. These are my two modern Swedish drawlooms. I actually have three now, but I haven't added the third one to this presentation. But everyone who's anyone has three drawlooms these days. This first one is a 100 centimeter Glamocra standard, just an ordinary countershed loom. It can either be countermarch or counterbalance. And it has a mirrorhead combination drawbridge on top of it. And I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute. But hopefully you can see there's a loom, sort of an ordinary loom off to your right. And then off to the left, there's like all these extra things. That's the drawbridge that I'm going to talk about in a minute. My second loom is an Ulla Cyrus combination draw loom. This was made for me. Well, all Ulla Cyrus looms are made for their buyers by AKS Snickery. They're in Sweden as well. And it is also a combination draw loom, and it is kind of huge. This is me sitting at it, surrounded by all the cordage and the sticks and the strings. And it looks, I think, in this picture quite different from the looms that most of us are used to weaving on. There's miles of mysterious looking cordage. There's stuff everywhere. And I do feel quite small when I'm weaving at this thing, kind of like the captain of a ship trying to do a million things at once. But my mission And the purpose of my YouTube channel is to show how this is just a loom like any other. It's really just like a shacked standard. It even has some of the same technology as a rigid heddle loom. If you can understand strings going up and down, then you can understand draw looms. And to that end, I'd like to talk about 3 questions today and hopefully answer them. What is a draw loom? What can it do and what can't it do? Then how it works, the mechanics of this crazy thing, stuff going up and down, sometimes up and down at the same time. And finally, we can ponder its design capabilities and how to exploit them. And my hope is that by the end of this, not only will draw looms be clear as anything and everybody understands everything there is to know about them, but hopefully some people will be inspired to maybe try draw loom weaving for themselves if they haven't already done so. I do want to point out for drawloom weavers in the audience that what I say is going to probably include a lot of overgeneralizations, a lot of, things where I'm going to gloss over details. Please do not be alarmed by that. So the first question is, what are drawlooms good for? Why do we even bother with them? And the answer is that drawlooms are good for figurative and richly patterned textiles woven any true unit interlacement. And I think that's the first question that we kind of need to unpack a little. If you'll forgive me, what is a unit interlacement and what do drawlooms do, for example, that Adobe loom can't do and vice versa, because there are huge differences between the two of them. A true unit weave, the thing that drawlooms do best, is one where the structure can be broken down into small repeating interlacements. Every interlacement group is identical to the next, and we stack and we put units in rows to create the cloth. What does that mean exactly? Well, here's an example of a true unit lacement, and I'm going to guess that most people listening to me now have woven this at some time in their life, and it's lace bronson. And lace bronson, or Atwater bronson, is constructed from 2 units, and we consider units usually in terms of pattern and ground. I'm going to be using the words pattern and ground a lot in this presentation. The ground cloth in Atwater bronson is made up of 6x6 squares of plain weave, right? That's all it is. Up, down, up, down, up, down, warp and weft, 6x6, 6 warp ends by 6 weft picks. There's another one. There's another one. There's 3 units of 6x6 plain weave. For the purposes of this little example, we're going to consider plain weave as our ground. Pattern units, which are almost always the same size as the ground units, in this case, are 6x6 squares of plain weave plus floats. And there's one. You can see there's a little bit of plain weave at the bottom and there's a little plain weave on the left. Other than that, what we're looking at is horizontal weft floats. There's another one and there's another one. And by adding these pattern units to our ground units, we can build up patterns on our cloth. We can design these pattern and ground units in different ways. For example, here's lace bronson in 3 blocks. The picture on the left, that's the side that faces up while we're weaving. I'm going to call that the front. And the picture on the right is the side that faces down when we're weaving. I'm going to call that the back. Here's our 3 blocks. There's 1, there's 2, and there's 3, right? That's what they look like when we're sitting weaving our cloth. And you can see our floats in yellow against our kind of red and yellow speckled ground cloth. If we do our tie-up on a conventional loom, it's a shacked standard, it's whatever it is, this is what it looks like. Not a direct tie-up loom, I have to say, an ordinary sort of shaft loom where we tie up the treadles. We need a certain number of shafts and certain number of treadles for each setup and then for each additional block as well. And I'm not going to go into these because it gets sort of tiresome. But my point is that by threading the pattern onto our loom and by tying it up in certain ways, we can produce simple or more complicated figures on our cloth. The blocks are always threaded onto the loom. We can't really change where they are unless we kind of change our treadling or rethread the loom. But here's lace bronson is woven on a drawloom. And you can see I don't even know how many blocks I have, a whole lot. An almost infinite number, in fact. You can see the plain weave there, and then you can see my little lacy blocks. And I can change the placement of my blocks on a drawloom on the fly without changing my threading. And this is the case for whatever kind of unit weave I'm weaving on the drawloom. This is the same warp, same weft, same everything, same treadling, same try-up, but I am able on the fly to change how my pattern is presented on the cloth that I'm weaving. There's another one. I'm only using 3 treadles and I think only 4 ground shafts for this. There are many weaves using ground and pattern units, and I'm just going to go through these so you can sort of understand the vast capabilities that drawlooms have. Interlacements may vary, but because they're unit weaves, we can weave them on a drawloom easily, and if you'll forgive me for saying so, really quite simply. Summer and winter. Summer and winter on the drawloom. Biterwand. Biterwand on the drawloom. That's my dueling rabbits. Double weave. Double weave on the drawloom. Front and back. Mostly, though, what we can do on the drawloom are twills and satins, which leads us to damask. That's what I want to talk about today. So what is damask exactly? And the definitions vary a little bit, but this is the one I'm going to use. Damask is a textile where weft emphasis blocks and warp emphasis blocks are exchanged on the same face of the cloth to create pattern. Those blocks can either be twill or they can be satin, or they can in fact be a mixture of both. But let's think about what that means for a minute. Let's use 5-end satin damask as an example. We build up our background with identical 5x5 weft effect pattern units. There's one, you can see 5x5, 5 warp ends, 5 weft picks in our interlacement that follows the satin counter rules. And there's another one. It's identical to the first, and another one, and another one, and another one. And that's how we build up our ground cloth. Great. Terrific cloth, but it's not very interesting. How to create pattern on our cloth? How do we make damask? If we turn that previous cloth over and look at the underside, this is what we get. A warp effect yellow cloth as opposed to a weft effect red cloth. There's one little pattern unit. If we were to crawl under our loom and look up as we were weaving this cloth, that's what we would see. But if we show both the top and the bottom at the same time, our weft effect 5-end units and our warp effect 5-end units on the same side of the cloth, we can build up pattern. In this case, we can see those 3 blocks that I showed you earlier. And you can see the red, in this case, we're going to call that red ground. Those are lots and lots of our little 5x5 weft effect ground units arranged against our lots and lots 5x5 warp effect yellow pattern units. And by building these weft effect and warp effect pattern units up and by arranging them in different ways, we create damask. Now, if you've ever woven, say, 4-end broken twill damask or 5-end satin damask, you will know that damask on a conventional single harness loom is incredibly infrastructure hungry. Why is that? Because for each pattern block, we need a whole separate set of treadles and shafts to create it. So for example, for 4-end broken twill, we need 4 treadles and 4 shafts for every single pattern block that we want to weave. On a drawloom, we no longer have that limitation. We can expand our pattern shafts kind of into the far distance, keeping just the number of treadles that we have, and create very, very complicated designs on our cloth. This is broken twill damask in 11 pattern blocks, all on the same warp, and I never had to change my threading in order to create it. So that's pretty cool. 8-end satin damask, for example, requires 8 shafts and 8 treadles per pattern block. So even on a 16 shaft Dobby loom, you only have 2 pattern blocks. You would need 24 shafts and 24 treadles to produce a 3-block pattern. If you've got a big Dobby loom, that's great, but now you're starting to kind of get to the limit of what a single harness loom can do. A Drawloom can produce, again, infinite varieties of 8-end satin easily and simply with only 8 shafts and 8 treadles. I'm going to skip ahead. Here is a beer mat woven in 6-end irregular satin damask. I think there's 44 blocks in the design. On a conventional loom, each block would require 6 shafts and 6 treadles, meaning you would need 264 shafts and treadles to weave this on a single harness loom if such a thing existed. I wove these with 6 ground shafts and 6 treadles, and I could change my patterns on the fly. So I'm going to show you all my beer mats. These are all inspired by the animals and creatures that we have in our backyard. I call them the backyard bestiary beer mats. But what I'm really trying to show is that I could create all of these different designs without rethreading my loom, which is really cool. And the question, I think, is, well, how does that happen? And the answer is it happens because a drawloom, unlike a single harness loom, has 2 harnesses. So let's define some terms. When I talk about shafts, I am talking about those sticks, those heddle bars that have the heddles hanging from them. In my case, they're made of Texsolve. When I talk about a harness, I'm talking about a group of shafts working together to produce a woven structure. So a single harness loom is a loom like a jack loom, a counterbalance loom, a countermarch loom, even a Dobby loom with 64 shafts is still a single harness loom because all of those shafts are working together to produce the same interlacement, the same textile. It might be crazy network twills or echo and iris or very, very complicated patterns, but it's still a single harness loom. A multi-harness loom, on the other hand, has multiple sets of shafts working sometimes in opposition to one another. It's like stacking a loom on top of another loom. Examples might include a Drawloom like mine, which is built on top of a countermarch loom. It might include those oldie-timey jacquard looms that used punch cards and had a head on top of an ordinary single harness loom. So what do these 2 harnesses do, and how do they work together to create these infinitely complicated figured textiles? Well, they have 2 harnesses. They have the ground harness and the pattern harness, and these neatly correlate to the ground cloth and the pattern on the cloth. And I'll talk about that in a second. We can rig the ground harness and the pattern harness to weave ground and pattern in any true unit weave. And I already showed you the biter wand and the double weave and all of those cool things that we can weave very efficiently on a Drawloom. Let's see how. Let's look at the ground harness first, and this is going to be familiar to everybody. My ground harness is found at the front of the loom, just behind the beater. If you have a floor loom, any kind of floor loom, that is where your shafts probably are. They're right behind the beater, towards the front of the loom as you sit to weave. Same thing on a Drawloom. The number of ground shafts equals usually the number of ends in my ground unit. They are fitted with long eye heddles, and they're often threaded straight. It's just like the simplest threading in the world, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. You can see, here's a picture of the long eye heddles. This is what makes a Drawloom work. This is what makes a Drawloom possible. The heddle eyes are about 2.5 inches tall, and at rest, the warp sits at the bottom of these heddle eyes. And this is because the ground harness, the thing that weaves the ground cloth, works as a rising shed loom, like any jack loom does. So say I set up my ground harness with 4 shafts, right? These 4 shafts are right at the front of the loom where you're used to seeing shafts. I can weave any ground structure that I want. Today, I'm going to weave broken twill damask. So my ground structure is going to be 4-shaft broken twill. This is the tie-up for my ground cloth, right? In this case, my black squares are representing rising shafts. So you probably recognize this. This is a 4-treadle, 4-shaft tie-up for broken twill, just like you would weave on a jack loom, for example. With a countermarch, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but with a countermarch, the tie-ups to the lower lambs determine which shafts are lifted when a treadle is pressed. So even though I've got a countermarch loom and it's got like ties and lambs everywhere, all it's doing is operating a simple rising shaft motion, just like it does on a jack loom. And you can see there on the, I've circled in white, those are the lower lambs. Those are my tie-ups for the rising shafts of my ground harness. And those tie-ups are the same as the tie-ups for any jack loom, any rising shed loom for 4-shaft broken twill. Probably recognize that. So when I cycle through my treadles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the weft effect 4-shaft broken twill cloth that I get. And I'm sure that looks familiar to you. In this case, I've got a yellow warp and a red weft, and that's the cloth that I look at as I sit to weave. That's what's showing up on top. It's kind of boring. That's why I have a pattern harness on my draw loom. That's why I have this other loom sitting on top of my basic standard loom. And the pattern harness is towards the rear of the loom, and I'm got a little arrow pointing to it there. So you can see my beater is at the front, my ground shafts are right behind it, and then behind those, hanging from the drawbridge and sitting inside an extension, are the pattern shafts. And this is where kind of the magic happens. This is the loom either within or on top of a loom, however you want to look at it. In my case, my pattern harness, these pattern shafts, consist of, I don't know, several pattern shafts. My warp is threaded onto those in groups. That's what the pattern shafts look like. And you can see that my pattern shafts are threaded not straight, but in this case, they're threaded in a point, in a V, which is going to enable me to weave any symmetrical pattern that I choose. The number of shafts, I've got my hand on, I think about 50 of them, equals the number of pattern blocks that I will have at my disposal. So even though I've got 4 ground shafts at the front of the loom, these 50 pattern shafts at the back of the loom enable me to weave 50 pattern blocks. They're threaded onto the loom, but they're completely flexible. The shafts are fitted with leashes, and you could see those there. Those little sticky up bits of Texol, those are my pattern leashes. And they look like this. They hang from the pattern shafts, and they're weighted with lingos because we're relying on gravity to make this whole thing work. Each leash is 1 repeat of the ground threading. And remember that I forget what we're weaving, 4-shaft broken twill, I think, which means that each leash will have 4 warp ends going through it, 4 adjacent warp ends. And those adjacent warp ends will give me 1 unit of my weave, whether it's ground or pattern. And you can see there how they're grouped together in 1 leash. And I raise the leashes that I want to show in pattern. In other words, if I want to weave a unit upside down so that it's warp effect rather than weft effect, I will raise one of my leashes using this cunning little pull handle bar, which is located right behind the beater of my loom. And if you saw that, I pulled the handle and a pattern shaft went up. And that's what creates my pattern shed. These units, the ones that are lifted up, are woven with a sinking shed. And that's in accordance with the tie-up to the upper lambs. And here you can see the upper lambs, they cause whatever ends I want to sink. Because I've got units that are raised on the pattern shafts, they're going to pull threads down like any sinking shed loom, and that's going to weave my pattern. In this case, as we said, my raised units are going to be woven in warp effect broken twill in accordance with the tie-up diagram that I'm showing you there. So while I cycle through my treadles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, because everything's straight threading on the ground shafts, wherever I have raised pattern units, this is what I'm going to get. My warp effect pattern units. So where pattern leashes are unraised, we weave ground. That's our weft effect ground cloth. And where pattern leashes are raised, we weave pattern, weft effect pattern units at the same time and in the same row. And that's because our loom is operating with a sinking shed and a rising shed at the same time. The ground shafts at the front are a rising shed. The raised pattern units at the back are a sinking shed. So we've got two looms kind of operating at the same time. And it is cool. And this is what it looks like. If I raise units, that's what I'm doing now, and I press a treadle, you can see that I've got ends going down and ends going up at the same time. We have that crisscross damask shed where I'm basically weaving some units upside down and some units right side up at the same time. And that's all the Drawloom is doing. It's weaving upside down and right side up at the same time, which is really cool. It's very ingenious, I think. So to see how this works in practice, let's consider our 3 blocks again. We'll render it in 5-end satin damask. We know that on a conventional single harness loom, we'll need 15 shafts and 15 treadles to do it. And this is what the drawdown would look like. On a Drawloom, it's super simple. You can see here's my ground harness. I've got 5 ground shafts with their long eye heddles and they're threaded straight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way across the warp. That never changes. And then this represents my 3 pattern shafts in the pattern harness at the back. This is how I've threaded the leashes. Each black square represents one of those pattern leashes, one of my pattern units. And you may realize at this point that every end in my warp is actually threaded through both harnesses. So every end is threaded twice. First through a pattern heddle on the rear harness, on the pattern harness, and then again through a long eye heddle on the ground harness at the front. So let's imagine for a minute that we've only got 3 pattern shafts in our rear harness. Each square here represents one unit on a pattern harness, I apologize, on a pattern shaft. Because we're weaving 5-end satin, each leash has 5 ends going through it, 5 consecutive ends, one pattern unit. So for example, there you can see there's 4 leashes on the shaft at the top, which represents the shaft at the back of the loom. There's 3 leashes on the shaft at the front of the loom, and so on. This is how I've chosen to arrange my leashes for this particular example. So if I raise the foremost pattern shaft, that one there, and I throw my 5 picks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pressing my 5 treadles, straight treadling, I'm going to get this on my cloth. And you can see where I do not have leashes raised, and we're looking at that bottom row there, that's the first pattern shaft. The bottom row, you can see where I have raised black squares, which is black leashes, I'm getting my warp effect pattern units. And where I do not have raised leashes, I am getting weft effect red units at the same time, just by treadling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's because of this crazy crisscrossy action of my pattern and ground harnesses. Oh, look at that. That's like really illustrative. Okay, so if I weave my second row and cycle through my treadles with that second pattern shaft lifted up, I'm going to get this. Notice that my yellow warp effect units have shifted in the warp, and that's because I have different units raised. And if I raise the rearmost pattern shaft, I'm going to get that. So as I cycle through my treadles and raise different pattern shafts, I am building up different arrangements of pattern and ground in my cloth. And I do this on the fly. Every time I treadle my 5 treadles, then I change my pattern shafts however I want them, and I weave the next row of cloth. So I can change my pattern without ever rethreading the loom. I'm kind of rethreading it virtually, is sort of how I think about it. Because as I lift different units using different pattern shafts, I am creating pattern in different places along the warp. And it's pretty cool. So let me skip ahead for a minute. And keep in mind that I can weave that profile in any unit weave that I want, depending on how I thread those ground shafts, basically. But the mechanism for how the damask shed works is the same no matter what the cloth is. Regardless of the structure, pattern blocks are determined by the setup of the leashes in the pattern harness and which ones I raise wherever I want pattern to appear. In every case, each leash is 1 pixel in our design. So that's how a Drawloom works. It's pretty cool. It's awesome, in fact. And that leads us to our third and final question, which is, okay, we've got our leashes working and we've got our ground shafts working, but how do we come up with our patterns? And the answer is that it's an iterative process where the setup of the leashes informs our design decisions and vice versa. For example, let's look at our 3-block pattern again. I've arranged my leashes in the pattern harness exactly like I showed you before. I've got 3 pattern shafts. I basically threaded the profile onto my pattern harness, right? It's very efficient, but it's very limiting. Over here on the right, you can see where normally treadling would appear. That's my lift plan. So I can see when I lift, for example, look at the bottom there, when I lift pattern shaft 3, I'm going to get those rows and so on. I do have some options. I can change the order of my pulls, right? Instead of 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, I can do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Or I can pull more than 1 pattern shaft at a time and build up pattern that way. But because I've threaded the profile onto my pattern shafts, I'm still limited by my pattern shaft threading. There's only so much I can do without going in there and rethreading the loom. But if I rearrange my leashes in different ways, I can actually expand the possibilities of my threading enormously. For example, at the beginning, I showed you that single point threading on my Ula Cyrus loom. Well, that enables me to produce a pattern like this. And you can see I've got my single V. I've got my vertical point of symmetry right down the middle of the cloth. And if you look at the lift plan on the right, you can see that I only have to lift half the pattern. And that's because everything to the left of that arrow is being woven automatically through the symmetrical arrangement of leashes on my pattern shafts. For example, there I lift 1 pattern shaft, right? Pattern shaft 5. And if you look at the very bottom there, you can see it's lifting up 2 units, 1 on either side of my vertical axis of symmetry, which makes an arrangement like this a really efficient and accurate way to create designs because I'm only having to lift half of the pixels. Oh, there they are. Those are the 2 that I was talking about. And with this V arrangement, I can change my pulls however my fancy takes me. So in this case, I'm treadling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And every time I get to the end of my sequence, I'm going to go to the next row of my lift plan. So I start at the bottom there, just lifting pattern shaft 5. And then in the next row, I'm going to lift pattern shafts 4 and 5. And I'm going to build up my design that way. But I don't have to lift that lift plan. I could lift this lift plan. I haven't had to rethread my loom. I'm not changing my treadling. The only thing I'm changing is which units I'm lifting when. And that gives me an enormous amount of flexibility. I could weave off a 25-yard warp and never repeat my design. There's another one. I never alter my treadling. I never alter my shuttle. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, single shuttle back and forth. And I can do whatever I want within the constraints of my single point threading. But maybe I don't want a big symmetrical pattern. Maybe I want something that looks like wallpaper. Well, on the fly, I can take those units and I can sort of juggle them around my pattern shafts. It's really cool. I don't have to take the loom apart to do that. I can just move my leashes around and I can create repeated points like this. So now if you look at my lift plan up the side, you can see that I'm only lifting half of each repeat. So basically with this repeated point threading, I'm not only providing symmetry to my design, but I'm tripling it across the warp. It's very quick, it's very efficient, can actually weave pretty fast using a repeated point threading. This is 55 leashes on only 10 pattern shafts. You can see what I can do with this symmetrical kind of wallpaper kind of threading. All I'm doing now is I'm changing my pulls. Same treadling, same throwing of the shuttle. The only thing I'm doing is changing my lift plan, which is what you see on the right. I can arrange my leashes in all different ways. What if I don't want symmetry? Well, I can arrange them in a straight threading like this. And within each of those straight threadings, you can see across the top, that's my arrangement of leashes. I can do little asymmetrical patterns within each of those straight threadings. If I want, I can reverse the direction of one of my straight threadings on the leashes, and that will flip one of my columns of cats, the cat on the second from the left. As you can see, he's just flipped. Again, I don't change my lift plan. I've only changed the arrangement of leashes on the back of my loom in the pattern harness. And if I don't want any repeats at all, I can put one leash on each of my pattern shafts. In this case, I've got 50 of them, and just weave whatever I can imagine on graph paper. This is just a matter of basically picking up every pixel that I want to show as pattern on my warp. For such a design, I probably wouldn't use pattern shafts. I would probably use something called a single unit or combination drawbridge. In this case, every unit is attached to its own draw cord over the beater. This is what the draw cords look like. And what that does is that allows me to pick up one pixel at a time. Remember, every unit that I raise is woven in a warp effect pattern unit. Wherever. Doesn't matter how I pick those units up. All that matters is that when they're picked up, they're weaving pattern rather than ground. Some Drawloom weavers use almost single units almost all the time, so they can just do free form thing. Connie did that, in fact. Just single units all the time to create artistic free form pieces, the sort of thing that, like anything you can draw on graph paper, you could create on your Drawloom. And that brings us to the sort of most fabulous loom of all, the combination Drawloom. And these amazing machines enable us to manipulate leashes singly, like I just showed you with the individual draw cords, or with the efficiency of symmetrical designs via pattern shafts. On this loom, you can see the pattern shaft pulls. Those are the pull handles on the right. And then there are single unit draw cords over the beater in the front. And this enables me to weave pretty much anything I can imagine. Here's an example of what the pattern harness on such a setup might look like. Here you can see the ground shafts are at the front of the picture, sort of away from us. The pattern harness is at the back. And you can see that I have a whole different bunch of arrangements like we've just talked about. I have a single point on either side for symmetrical borders. I have repeated points across the front of those shafts. Those are for repeated designs in the central panel of a piece. And then also in the borders, I have single unit draw cords, and that's going to enable me to pick up anything I want within those borders. Oh, well, there they are. Okay. And I want to get into a little bit about what those sorts of setups can help me do, or you too, if you decide to go down this route. That setup, which is really quite complicated, was inspired by a set of napkins that I just loved. Well, it wasn't a napkin that inspired me. It was this piece that inspired me. It's a wall hanging by Elfrida Svensson, who was a damask weaver in 19th century Sweden. And she did this monumental collection of pieces reflecting the view that she saw outside her house. And you can see she was very lucky. She saw things like windmills and lighthouses and farmhouses and beautiful, beautiful Swedish scenery. And you can see, I hope, how the central panel of that thing is repeated. There's windmills, right? There's 3 windmills. There's 3 lighthouses. There's 3 fishing huts. There's several symmetrical houses across the bottom. There's symmetry in the borders on either side, although the little leaves in the middle are not symmetrical. And I deduced that she had used a setup somewhat similar to this. You can see there's the repeated points across the bottom of the threading diagram, the leash diagram. That's how the lighthouses and that's how the windmills are repeated. And then there's points on either side, and that gives us those stripes. And then there's single draw cords represented in red across the middle. And that's how we would get those crazy asymmetrical leaves. And that enabled me to do scenes of the town where I grew up, which is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And I hope you can see that the setup of this piece is almost identical. I've got those Swedish borders down the sides and across the top. I have repeated points across the middle, and I have asymmetrical words inside my borders that I am allowed, that my single draw cords permit me to weave. In this case, this is the Central Moravian Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the Moravians go to celebrate services every Sunday. You can see the cupola on top of the church where the trombone choir performs. And it says Starry Night over Bethlehem because this is supposed to be a piece representing Christmas with the dove of peace. This is another piece. This is exactly the same warp. It's exactly the same setup. All I did was change my pulls as I was weaving it, and the warp color, sorry, the weft color, of course. But you can see, I think, the similarities. I have the repeated points across the middle, that's City Hall, and the Single Brethren's house, and the Japanese tea hut that sits in our Garden of Serenity, and different asymmetrical language up the sides. Same setup, same warp, same exact treadling, same exact throwing, just different pull handles. And there's another one of our steel mill on the south side, which is no longer working, but is still a protected landmark, and Lehigh University. These are in 32 cotton, set at about 70 EPI. They're napkins is what they are. But the point is that they were all possible because of the Drawloom. I can't even tell you how many pattern blocks are in these, hundreds probably. But with the Drawloom, they're quite simple to weave. I'm throwing a single shuttle back and forth. I treadle my 6 treadles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I change my pulls. I throw my shuttle 6 more times. I treadle 6 more times, and I do this until I'm done. On the same warp, I was also able to produce these pieces. Again, we can see the repeated symmetrical designs across the middle, but instead of using single units for the borders, I used those single points that we saw on the pattern shafts. And that allowed me very quickly to just bang out a simple symmetric border with a rather elaborate central panel. That's my kitchen, by the way. That's my Wolf cooker and the window over the sink. This is our family room. These are these are my COVID pieces because I was stuck at home. What else was I going to weave? So I wove the things that I was looking at in my house. Those are our two cats. If you've watched my videos, you know that I'm adored my cats, Jensen and Button. Same setup, same tread length. The only thing different is that I'm pulling different handles. And there's my loom room. And there's our family bath with the bathtub and the toilet and the vanity and the hand woven rug. Um, Anything that I can imagine, anything I can draw on paper, I can weave on my Drawloom. And then I got kind of bored with like scenes of Bethlehem, even though Bethlehem is lovely. I got kind of bored with that. And I certainly got bored with the house. And my son suggested, well, why don't you immortalize the movies that we're watching every night on TV because we can't go out? And so I started my series Black and White Blockbusters. Again, all I've changed is the color of my weft and the order of my pulls. The warp and the setup on the loom is exactly the same. This is Thor. There's Anthony Hopkins at the top and Rene Russo. Lots of things to do with Asgard and fighting evil or whatever they do in Thor. This, of course, is Star Wars. Again, there's lots of symmetry. There's lots of asymmetry. Anything I could do with that setup, I did. This is Pirates of the Caribbean. This is my favorite, I think. This is Pirates of the Caribbean. And the reason why I like this piece so much is if you look at the skeletons, notice how they're white on black. But if you look at Johnny Depp above the skeletons, they're black on white. And that's because for the skeletons, instead of pulling pattern, I pulled background. Background and pattern can sometimes get a little confused on the Drawloom. By pulling more handles than I leave down, I can actually weave, I can change how my background and my background color. So instead of pattern being black on a white ground, I can make white ground on white pattern on black ground. I'm often inspired by old figurative designs. I found this picture in an old issue of Vav magazine. It's a rug that's currently in a medieval castle somewhere in Sweden. And I really loved it. And maybe now you already can see possibly how this thing was constructed on a Drawloom. There would have been a single point threading in the middle. There would have been some sort of arrangement down the sides for the borders. They could have either been mounted on the leashes as a profile with those lines, or maybe they had single unit pulls, not really sure. But you can see that they definitely had two different arrangements of pulls for the center and the border, and a cool striped warp, which would be seen to best effect if you wove this thing upside down, which is what I did. I thought it would make great kitchen towels. And although I doubled the size of the central border because I wanted it to be like good towel dimensions and 8-2 cotton, I was able to deduce how those pulls on the sides were done as well. And that's the really cool thing about a Drawloom, is that you can take any design, and as long as you kind of think about, well, how can I arrange my leashes so that I can weave that kind of efficiently? You can weave these things pretty fast, and you can weave anything that you can imagine. And that got me thinking. Once I'd woven that, I thought, well, I can add some single unit pulls down my borders, and I can do anything I want with those. And that's how I came up with my very ambitious kitchen towel. And then I thought, yeah, but now I can change my pulls in the center. I've got yellow and black, that'll make great bees. So I did my How Doth the Little Busy Bee towel. Again, it's exactly the same setup. I'm just changing my pulls. And then I went to the Philadelphia Art Museum. This was right before COVID, and I got inspired by some fracture and skeletons, and we were all feeling a little bit negative. And I came up with my COVID piece, which is a memento mori that says, today it is us, tomorrow it is you. And you can see now I'm reversing. Now I've got this black background and yellow pattern as opposed to yellow pattern on a black background. And that's just by changing how many pulls I do and when I pull them and how. And then I thought I really liked that. So I did my Star Wars piece, Embrace the Dark Side. Again, all I did was change my pulls. And then I discovered that by adding colored stripes to my weft, I could actually do very, very cool things with my pattern pulls in conjunction with the stripes in the warp. This is something that drawloom weavers, I think, ought to do more. Color play is very interesting on drawlooms. Those were bags that I did sideways. So now the borders are going across the top, and we have a bag that says bits and pieces, and we have a bag that says notions on it. Sometimes inspiration comes from a textile that I come across somewhere. This one was in a tub at Marshfield. It's a piece of calamanco that Kate Smith wove years ago. It's a beautiful, beautiful striped wool piece. And then I discovered that figured calamanco was a thing and that you can add, if you have a draw loom, figures within those stripes. I thought that was pretty cool. And by setting up a pretty complicated arrangement of pattern leashes, these are the pattern shafts, and this is the arrangement of leashes on the pattern shafts. And you can see I've got some straight threading, like those cats that I showed you before, and I've got some repeated points, like the repeated point panels that I showed you before. And I've even got some units at the very back that never move at all. I discovered that I could produce very complicated figured patterns within my stripes very quickly and very efficiently. This turned out to be really good cloth for book cloth. I could even put, if I wanted, the titles of the books across the spine or the authors across the front. In this case, that's one of my favorite books of all time, Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson. And I really love this piece because using the draw loom and the different arrangements of leashes on the pattern shafts, I could create completely different things within each of those vertical warp stripes. The possibilities really are kind of endless. Sometimes I just take a draft and I run with it. You've probably all seen this one. It's in the public domain. Robin Spady publicized it a while ago. It's from Heinrich Liese's pattern book. I loved it. I loved those ribbons. I loved the little monk's belt designs inside them. And I decided that I could do some pretty cool things with my drawloom. And in the end, what I did is I took each of those little monk's belt uh, spaces in between the stripes, and I filled them with little repeated points of all different patterns and animals and things that I could see in my backyard. That's a wool shawl. I really like that piece a lot. Or I might personalize a design that I really love. When I first got my copy of Atwater's recipe book, I knew I had to weave that weaver. She's just too cool. And so I made some hangings for myself and some friends. All you have to really do is look at that picture, chart it out in a piece of graph paper, figure out how to load it onto the pattern shafts of your draw loom, and you're away. On the same warp, I was able to create this. This was done using single units all across the middle of the piece. Actually, this is almost all single units, and you can see this is a map of Bethlehem. It's sort of stylized, but there's Central Moravian Church at the bottom going up through town all the way to South Mountain with its star on top. But by having a single point, I was also able very quickly to weave this piece, which is just worker piece. And of course, my signature dueling rabbits. Just change the color of the weft, just change the order of the pulls, and you can weave anything you want. So that is, in a nutshell, how drawlooms work. And I hope that has demystified them a little bit. I think that they're amazing analog tools. I think everybody should weave on them at least once in their career. Try it out. If you can weave on a single harness loom, you can weave on a draw loom. And they just give us so much freedom to design and express ourselves. and create just beautiful figure designs as fussy or as plain as we like. So I hope if you're interested, you will look at my channel, Dueling Rabbits Hand Weaving, which is, I believe, the only, I think it's the only YouTube channel that has much Drawloom content at all, much less is dedicated to Drawlooms. Come up to Vavstuga. I know some of your members have already done that to learn Drawlooms at Drawloom ABC. If you're more advanced already, we have a great Drawloom class, Drawloom DEF, which is a 2-week class that really delves into all of the issues that I've been talking about today. Um, if you know someone who has a Drawloom, ask them to let you try it out. They're awesome machines, and I think everybody should try one at least once in their weaving career. You owe it to yourself. So again, thank you very much for having me here to talk to you today about my passion. If you have any questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them. Everyone's stunned into silence. That always happens.
I have two questions. The
Yes.
first one would be, do you design just on graph paper or do you use computer software?
So that's a good question. I personally don't design on graph paper. I find it just because you're always erasing and stuff. So I do use either Fiberworks or Weave Point, but I only use it just as a quick way to be able to add and subtract pixels to my design. They're all Fiberworks Silver gives you up to 64 units to play with, which is wide enough for most um, it's wide enough for most pattern shaft designs. For single unit designs, people usually just use like cross stitch software, just something that's automated so you can just click pixels on and off without having to mess with mirrors and uh, erasers and stuff like that. But yeah, it's still very much a hand process of, ooh, do I want a pixel there or do I want it there?
So
Yeah.
you're basically doing the profile draft in
It
Fiberworks.
is as far as Fiberworks concerned, it's a profile draft. And instead of a treadling, it's a lift plan. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Weave Point is very expensive. It actually does have a double harness option where you can load up the entire structure. So not only can you see the figurative design, but you can see the interlacement of each individual unit, which is kind of cool. It enables you to sort of get an idea of what would happen if you started mixing structures, but it's sort of overkill. And I find that Fiberworks or a cross stitch program and a profile is good enough. And then I fill in the structure in my head.
Question two. So obviously these are Swedish looms. There's a lot of Swedish technique. In Sweden, do all weavers learn to use draw looms, or is
No.
it really like a special subset?
I think it's quite common for Vavstugas to have one or two drawlooms on the premises. And it's certainly more popular there than it has been here traditionally, although it's amazing, I think, how drawloom weaving is taking off in this country. We're filling, I think, 9 classes this year, and with waiting lists a mile long. So drawloom weaving is really taking off, and I think one of the reasons for that is the availability of the new Julia Drawloom, which is really a cool little, I mean, it's a fully functional, fabulous 20 shaft pattern shaft drawloom, but it's small, it's compact, it doesn't break the bank. It's a really nice entry into drawloom weaving. They're proving really popular. But
And
yeah, you do
Vivstuga
need a
is selling
Swedish
them, right?
counter shed loom. That's the only way you can get a drawloom to work.
Thank you.
I'm
Linda, you
sorry,
had
did
some
I interrupt
questions?
somebody?
No,
Yeah,
Linda
I had a
had some
bunch of questions. Is Vevstuga is selling those, aren't they?
Yep,
The Julia.
sure
And
are.
when I
And in
took
fact,
the
we have one that's like permanently set up for people to come and try. FYI.
when and will they work with any loom, or you have to have a
So,
glamacra loom?
so a draw loom has to go on a counter shed loom because you have to have threads going up and threads going down at the same time
Hmm.
to get those two sheds to work. A jack loom there are other ways to do it. I mean, split shed weaving is obviously the best way to mimic this. It doesn't mimic the action, but it mimics the kind of the result.
Mm-hmm.
Pickup sticks. I mean, really what a drawloom is like pickup sticks at the back of a
Mm-hmm.
at the back of a counter shed loom with long eye heddles. But for an actual drawloom, the way I've described that crazy damask shed going up and down and crisscrossy, you have to have a counter shed loom. Can either be a counterbalance loom or a counter march loom. It doesn't matter. They both work great. Um, but yeah, you have to have some way of getting threads going up and threads going down at the same time.
So every line, every every row, every pull,
Yeah.
you have to pull down each of the threads, well, the little pulleys,
Yeah.
you have to pull them down for each row of graph paper.
Right.
And that seems very time consuming. And if you're doing a repeating pattern, you have to do each row over and over again every time you come to that pattern again. There's no way of repeating a pattern. You're really doing row by row, pulling down the
You are. So you're
little
saving
pulleys.
time with your repeated points. So you might, even if you have like 12 repeats across the warp, you still may only have 4 or 5 handles to pull.
Right.
But you're right. For every identical row, you're going to be pulling the same handles. And there are ways around that. There are shortcuts. You can tie stuff up and arrange lashes, and there's things you can do. But
So about
yes,
how long?
it is not fast.
Yeah, I was going to say, about how long did it take you to do like the dish towels?
So a dish towel I can usually do in 1 or 2 good sittings.
Uh-huh.
It's faster than you
Good
think.
8 hour sittings?
No, 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 no. I mean, I'm thinking like at Webstuga, for instance, where we have 5 days of weaving. It's not unusual for someone to produce 2 or 3 good square pieces, pretty elaborate square pieces. You get into the rhythm, and don't forget, you're not worried about treadling because it's a straight treadling. That goes fast. So
Yeah.
you pull your handles, you do your treadles, that's fast, and then you rearrange your pulls. And it gets surprisingly fast and efficient because you can see the pattern growing. You don't even need to look at your plan anymore. It's almost intuitive. People are always surprised at how fast it goes and how fun it is.
Mhm.
It's really fun to sit there like pulling handles and throwing your shuttles and thwacking away with your beater. It's a very satisfying weave because
I
every
found
row
it
is different and it's
incredibly
never
fun,
boring.
but
I'm, s-
I found it incredibly fun, but it is a little slow.
yeah, I won't argue with you there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, wait. So here's a question, Amy. How and when did you first discover Drawlooms?
So that's a good question. And people ask me that, and I honestly can't really remember. I think it was when I saw a video. I think it was the curmudgeon who went to Vavstuga, and he was casting his camera around the studio before weaving began, and there were these amazing things in the wall. And I was just like, that's what I want to be able to weave. A good way to get into double harness weaving is through like something like Smolensvev or one of these threaded opamped things where you can do really incredibly complicated designs without a draw loom. You can just thread them onto the loom and treadle them and have 2 harnesses. It's really cool. And you can see my channel for videos about that. You don't really need a draw loom. There are ways that you can kind of get yourself easy into draw loom weaving without like buying a draw loom with half heddle sticks and a weaving sword, or with a second harness built onto your single harness loom. Yeah, check out my YouTube channel about that. I have two. It's a playlist called like No Draw Loom, No Problem, and that's a really good entryway into double harness weaving before you actually go out and like invest in a draw loom.
So, oh, there's a follow-up question, and it says, does your YouTube videos teach design and weaving?
Yep. I won't say that it's an organized course because it's not. I've just been making videos as I get questions and as things strike me. But if you go onto my website, I now have a table of contents for the channel, kind of organized in a sensible way. So if you're at all curious and want to kind of make sense of my channel, go to my website. It's duelingrabbits.com. Go to About Drawlooms, and there's a PDF that you can download. And that kind of divides the channel up into things like structures and design and setup and mechanics and troubleshooting and all the things that I personally find interesting. And that might give you a good overview of what the channel does. I've got like 35 videos now, I think, so it's a little hard to wade through because they're not in any particular order. So yeah, go and download the PDF. And that should give you a pretty good idea of how it all works.
So there's another question, and someone asked if you had to physically get up from the bench to pull the leashes, but they're little levers to your front.
That's correct.
Side.
They're little levers right over the beater. And different draw looms are different ways. There's that other picture that I showed you where the pull handles were off to the right as I sat to weave. If you're weaving with half petals and a weaving sword, yeah, you got to get up and trot to the back of the loom and lift pattern shafts and sticks underneath, and that's kind of a production. And a draw loom is really just an easy way of kind of adapting that process for one person at the front of the loom. I mean, in old days, of course, yeah, there was a second person pulling leashes. He was either sitting up in the superstructure of the loom or at the side of the loom, manually pulling these things. That's where the word dobby loom comes from. It comes from the draw boy who used to physically manhandle these things up and down. And that was a very skilled job, actually, doing that. So one person would sit to weave, and the second person would be messing with leashes. And they still do that in some parts of the world where this isn't automated yet. It's fascinating.
Any other questions? That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I hope to see you all at Drawloom ABC at some point in the near future.
And that's at Valstuga?
Yes, and if anybody does want to follow up or has any particular questions, I'm very happy. Just shoot me an email, amy@duelingrabbits.com. I'm very happy. I mean, my mission is to get everybody into this. So anybody who has questions or wants to know more, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And I'll see you all up there.
Okay. Thank you, Amy. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Hang on.